Hi guys, we are at the end of our Animal Kingdom unit, so I thought it would be a good idea to refresh us on our notes. You can either review the notes on your own or you can go through it with me. Remember that the Animal Kingdom is so diverse. What are some things they have in common? They're all heterotrophs, which means they cannot make their own food. They have to consume something else to get their energy. They are all eukaryotic. Remember, that means they have cells with a nucleus and with membrane-bound organelles. All animals are multicellular, and their cells lack cell walls. Remember, it's just plant cells that have cell walls. It might surprise you to know that 95% of animals are invertebrates, which means they don't have a backbone. Even though some of them have exoskeletons, they do not have a backbone. Only 5% of our animal kingdom has a backbone, so we call them vertebrates. We can also define animals and categorize them by how they obtain their energy. So animals that eat plants are called herbivores. Animals that eat other animals or meat are called carnivores. Animals that eat both are called omnivores. And an animal that feeds on decaying organic material is called a detritivore. Some animals are what we call filter feeders, which means they strain their food from the water that they suck in. An example would be like here we have on the screen a basking shark, and of course our really simple animal, the sponges. They are both filter feeders. Some animals are parasites, which means they depend on a host organism for their nutrients. They'll either live inside that host organism or they'll live on the other organism. Some examples that we talked about were roundworms, tapeworms, ticks, and lice. Animals vary on how they get their oxygen. Some of them, for respiration, will use lungs, like what we have, which takes in O2 and exhales CO2. Some of our animals have gills to respire, and some of them just simply diffuse the oxygen and CO2 through their skin. And you should have learned that when you did the frog dissection, because that's one reason why there is so much mucus on the skin. Animals and their circulatory systems vary. Some are very simple and open, which means there's no vessels, arteries, veins. Their internal environment is just bathed in the blood. Some are closed circulatory systems like what we have, where blood is contained inside vessels and the oxygenated blood is separate from the deoxygenated blood. Movement of animals just is so diverse. It varies so much. Some of them are swimming, flying, slithering, crawling, and some are completely sessile, which means they don't move at all. Let's talk about reproduction. Most animals reproduce sexually. That's when we form a zygote when the sperm penetrates the egg cell. Sometimes fertilization is internal, but it can also be external. You see a lot of aquatic animals that are going through external fertilization. Some animals are what we call hermaphrodites, which means they have both female and male reproductive parts, like our earthworm. Many animals also reproduce asexually, meaning they don't need another organism. There's no zygote being formed. Some different examples of asexual reproduction would be like budding, fragmentation, regeneration, and parthenogenesis. I would encourage you to re-watch the animal development video here. I'm not going to play it right now, but when you go back and you start reviewing the unit, I would encourage you to watch our crash course video. Now we're going to talk about symmetry. Symmetry is the body plan of the animal and how its parts are arranged. If there's no pattern to how the parts are arranged, we call them asymmetrical, like your coral, like your sponges. Some animals have radial symmetry, which means their body plan is arranged around a wheel. And some examples of that would be like starfish, hydra, jellyfish. Here's a picture of a jellyfish. We also watched just a quick video on that. You can review that on your own time. And we got to see one in person when we did our stations. Some animals like us have what's called bilateral symmetry. So if you were to draw a line down the middle of the body, which is a medial section, it would have a similar right and left side. Okay, so some examples besides humans would be like insects, cats, and most mammals. One big step in evolution was an anterior concentration of sense organs. That is known as cephalization, which means to have a head. So the body plans become more complex over time as you explore the different phyla of the animal kingdom. Some terms that you've seen since we've been doing virtual dissections, you might have seen words like anterior, toward the head, posterior, which would be towards the tail. Also, you've seen dorsal and ventral. Dorsal means back, and ventral means bottom or belly side. Let's talk about the phyla in the animal kingdom. It starts with our really simple phyla, and then we'll be going in order of complexity all the way to chordata. We'll be ending with that. So our most simple animals are going to be the phylum Porifera, which is our sponges. They don't have any tissues or organs. They are asymmetrical. They're completely sessile, which means they're stationary. That makes them filter feeders. They can feed on what comes by in the water. Next in complexity, we have Cnidaria. That's going to include your sea anemones, the jellyfish, the hydra, and the coral. They do have specialized tissues and they display radial symmetry. They can be sessile or they can float. They capture prey and digest it in a cavity inside their body. Next, we have our flatworms. This is the phylum Platyominthes. Remember how fun that word is to say, Platyominthes. So we had a lab all about planarians. They are very simple, flat, no segmentation. You can see the eye spots here, the auricles on the side. This phylum also includes tapeworms, known as cestodes. And tapeworms live inside of a host, usually in the intestines of the host, and you can get those by ingesting contaminated food. Next phylum is the nematoda, which are our roundworms. Still no segmentation, all right? They're free-living parasites. Next in complexity is Annelida. These are our segmented worms, so the leech, the earthworm. Within their segmented bodies, they have a cavity known as a coelom. They display bilateral symmetry, and a really big step in complexity is that they have two openings to their body. They have a defined mouth and a defined anus, all right? So closed circulatory system is also more complex. They're respiring right through their skin through simple diffusion. You can watch a crash course video on the simple animals, the kingdoms that we just the phyla that we just talked about. Moving on, we have our mollusks. Mollusca includes clams, squid, and snails. So that's our gastropods, like snails, our bivalves, like mussels, like clams, and cephalopods, like the squid. They're going to have more complex tissues and organs. They have a foot, digestive tract, a mantle. They even have a radula, which is like a tongue-like organ they use to scrape algae off of rocks and off the bottom of the ocean and freshwater systems. Mollusks have gills, so that's how they're getting their oxygen. Most have an open circulatory system, but the more complex mollusks are going to have closed circulatory systems. One thing to remember about arthropods is that they are the largest phylum in the whole animal kingdom. Okay, 2 more bites. 2 more bites of eggs. Sorry about that. Anyways, so this is the largest phylum in the animal kingdom. It contains the most number of species. What are the arthropods? We're talking about all our crustaceans, all of our spiders, and all of our insects. Some things they have in common are segmentation. They have a defined head, a thorax, and an abdomen region. Their exoskeleton is made of chitin. As they grow, they actually molt. So when they outgrow their exoskeletons, they will shed it and then grow a new one to manage their size. They have jointed appendages, which give them flexibility and mobility. They're pretty diverse when it comes to respiration. They could have gills, some have book lungs, and some respire through tracheal tubes. Let's talk about the echinoderms. So much more than just starfish. The Echinodermata phylum includes sea stars, sea urchins, sand dollars, sea cucumbers, and much more. These were the first animals to have an endoskeleton. Most of them have radial symmetry, and they have tube feet, which help them very slowly move through their environment. Here's another crash course video you can review on your own time. Now we're on to the chordates. All right, this is the phylum that we belong to. Some examples would include like this lizard, fish, birds, amphibians, and mammals. What are some things that they all have in common? Some point during their development, they all have a dorsal tubular nerve cord, a postanal tail, a notochord, and pharyngeal pouches. We have vertebrate chordata and we have invertebrate chordata. So remember the difference between those two. Let's break down the vertebrates. Fish have a very flexible skeleton. It is made of cartilage and some bone. They're going to have jaws, fins, scales. You've seen gills on a fish before, and they have a closed circulatory system. Here are the main parts of a fish. All right, you're pretty familiar with that. Just remember the swim bladder allows the fish to control their own buoyancy. Quick video to review on your own time. Our aquatic species are coming on land, and that leads us to the amphibians. Amphibians are really special because they spend part of their life in the water and part of their life on land. So what happened when they were evolving? Their bones had to become stronger to survive the terrestrial environment. They developed lungs to breathe the air, and those fins that we saw actually evolved into limbs so that they could walk on land. So the larval version, like in a frog, the tadpoles are herbivores, and the adults are usually carnivores. They respire as young through gills, but as the adults grow, they develop lungs. As you saw with our virtual frog dissection, the heart is a double loop. It's got a 3-chambered heart, so their ventricle is just partially divided, whereas you saw with the pig, it was 4 chambers and it was completely divided. Frogs lay eggs in the water. Fertilization is external, and remember the larval stage is aquatic. The term metamorphosis means the changes that occur as the organism grows. So you can see here it starts as an egg, then we have our tadpole stages, and then eventually that adult frog will lose that tail. Let's move on to reptiles. What are some differences between reptiles and amphibians? Well, they spend all of their life on land. That's not saying they don't go in the water, but their exoskeletons, their endoskeletons are very strong. They usually have claws. They're cold-blooded, meaning they cannot regulate their internal environment. It's just going to mirror what's going on the outside. Their skin is much more dry and scaly because they're not in the water as much. They lay amniotic eggs, so their eggs are laid on land. They respire with lungs. Their ventricle is partially divided, just like the amphibians. Their fertilization is internal. Here are some features of the amniotic egg. It contains a water and food supply for the developing embryo. It must be laid on land, and it has a shell to protect that embryo. Here are some different types of reptiles. We can divide them into oviparous, which means their eggs are laid and incubated outside the body. Ovoviparous are incubated inside the body, but they're born live. And viviparous means there's a live birth with no eggs. Let's talk about the aves, the birds. Ornithology is the study of birds. Some characteristics that their limbs have been evolved into wings to establish flight. They have feathers. Their skeletons are very lightweight. They are endotherms, so they can regulate their internal environment. They have a completely divided ventricle, so birds have a 4-chambered heart. Their feathers are different depending on what the function is. The down feathers provide insulation. Contour feathers go over the head and body. That gives them their distinct markings. And then the flight feathers you'll find on the wings and tail provide lift. Here's a diagram of a bird pointing out the major parts. It's a double loop, closed circulatory system. Lungs are connected to air sacs, which does the exchange of gases. Here we are at mammals. So let's talk about the class Mammalia. Some mammals have very little hair, but almost all of them have hair, and a few have blubber. They have specialized teeth, endothermic. They will have mammary glands, which lactate or produce milk for their young. And then there's a diaphragm located underneath the lungs that aids in breathing. How do mammals stay warm? They have their hair to insulate them, or if they don't have hair, they might have blubber, which is a layer of subcutaneous fat. Mammals also have placentas. The placenta provides the developing fetus with nourishment and attaches to the wall of the uterus. The placenta is birthed after the baby is born. Mammary glands produce milk to feed their young. Mammary glands are only found in mammals. Here's a picture and diagram of the diaphragm, which is this muscle. When it relaxes, we're exhaling. When it contracts, we're inhaling. We talked about mammals having specialized teeth. So the physiology of the teeth is going to give way to the anatomy of the teeth, which means form leads to function. Here's our incisors. This is for biting. Our canines are more pointed for stabbing and holding. And then the molars are more flat. That's for crushing and grinding. Mammals have really diverse diets. Herbivores often have an extra stomach chamber called a rumen to help them digest the cellulose and the fiber in plant material. Mammals have a 4-chambered heart. We call it a double loop circulation. Remember that we are keeping the oxygenated blood separate from the deoxygenated blood. Most mammals give birth to live young. There's 2 groups that are exceptions. The monotremes lay eggs, and the marsupials develop their young in a pouch. So let's look at some marsupials. Mammals that bear their young in an immature state, and the babies develop in the pouch. Most of our marsupials are found in Australia. Opossums are the ones that we would find on other continents. If you've never seen a baby kangaroo born, I would encourage you to watch this video. It's really neat. All mammals have what's called a gestation period, which is how long it takes for their baby to develop and be born. Ours is about 9 months. That leads me to the end of the notes. I hope you've enjoyed our review session, and I look forward to talking to you next week.